Hi there! Welcome to Philosophy 115 at UNCG, University of North Carolina at Greensboro. This course is currently called Practical Reasoning, but we're in the process of changing the name to Critical Thinking, which I prefer for a variety of reasons. So let's just call it that. Welcome to Philosophy 115, Critical Thinking. I'm Dr. Adam Rosenfeld, and I'm the instructor for this course. If you have any questions or concerns about how this course is laid out or how it runs, please don't hesitate to contact me so that we can try to work out some sort of mutually agreeable understanding. So, as I said, the preferred title for this class is Critical Thinking. So this class is about critical thinking. Well, what is that? My experience in talking to people about critical thinking is that lots of people use that word in lots of different ways. Even folks who are kind of professionally engaged with critical thinking will use that term, critical thinking, in subtly different ways. I know that, I have a family member who once jokingly asked me, isn't all thinking critical? Suggesting maybe, critical thinking is, important thinking, that we mean critical in this kind of sense of importance. But that seems like that's not really quite what critical thinking is. Not all thinking is. While all thinking might be important, not all thinking is critical thinking. It's a particular style of thinking, not just important sorts of thinking. It is important. Critical thinking is important, but that's not what makes it critical. Maybe we want to kind of latch on to this sense of criticism in critical thinking. Maybe critical thinking is used for criticism. I think that gets a little bit closer to the truth, but we want to maybe be careful that we don't suggest that critical thinking is always negative, that it's always on the attack, that it only criticizes. Perhaps there might be some clue to be found in the etymology of the term critical, which comes from the Greek term kritikos, meaning discernment or judgment. And that gets even closer to what critical thinking is all about. That it's about the sort of style of thought that we bring when we have to be discerning, when we have to make careful judgments. So by my estimation, and that's, I guess, fairly important because I'm designing this class that you're taking, the heart and soul of the critical stance in critical thinking lies in this capacity to take a step back from some belief and honestly assess whether or not there's good reason to hold it. Critical thinking gets taught under the auspices of lots of different disciplines, and they're all going to focus in slightly different ways on particular features of critical thought or particular aspects or components of critical thought. Philosophy is no different than this. We look at critical thinking through a particular lens. But I would say that all critical thinking involves at least these three major pillars or major components. The first one is an analytic component, the second one is a social component, and the third one is a psychological component. Let's look kind of briefly at each of those. So that first dimension, and this is the one that this course, like many other philosophical approaches to critical thinking, spends the majority of its focus on, is this analytic component to critical thought. Sometimes folks might think of it as a logical component to critical thought. This refers to the need for critical thinkers to provide reasons that justify why the things that they think are actually believable. And this is generally addressed under the rubric of rational argument and analytic strategies for determining when a good rational argument has been given, when good justificatory reasons are supporting a conclusion well versus when they're doing so poorly. While on rare occasions our conclusions might be so well supported that we might be tempted to use terms like proof or certainty when we talk about them, in most cases, and I would say probably the most interesting sorts of cases, I end up having to navigate a spectrum of reasonable confidence. Not really certainty so much, but also not no reason at all to believe something. And doing this well requires that I identify the appropriate style of justification for the kind of question that I'm trying to settle, and to understand what it is that makes various styles and strategies of argumentation work, and what makes them break down. The second pillar, or the second dimension or component of critical thinking, as we said, is this social dimension. Maybe we can get some sense of this by attending to that term argument and looking at it a little bit closer. Typically, the word argument conjures up a sort of a combative interaction, maybe one where tempers flare, something that's very emotionally charged. In the context of critical thinking, argumentation is anything but. Good critical thinking is as much about discursive etiquette as it is about logical analysis. It demands that I exhibit respect for my interlocutors and that I argue accordingly. I need critical thinking, and we all need critical thinking the most when we have to navigate disagreements. And in order to do this, we have to seek to charitably understand the reasons for why others are coming to different conclusions that we are. Good critical thinkers are able to go beyond just understanding what it is that somebody else is trying to say. They're able to draw out the best possible argument from their interlocutor, to perhaps rehabilitate the thought process of the person that they're arguing with. And effective critical thinking recognizes that while we all ultimately are going to seek to think for ourselves, this doesn't need to mean that we have to think by ourselves. Effective critical thinking seems to be aware of this way in which talking with other people, especially people who disagree with us, and taking their perspective seriously is a huge part of me actually being able to think for myself. So the third of those three components is a psychological component, or psychological dimension to critical thinking. Effective critical thinking takes the best aspects of our natural thought processes, but it makes them explicit and kind of turns them into a methodology. And this requires a sort of a metacognitive attention to our own thought process. It requires that we think about the ways that we're thinking, and this takes a tremendous amount of cognitive effort. Intentionally habituating reliable patterns of thought, making it a habit, in the way that I think and the way that I talk with others, goes a long way towards kind of reducing the hurdle of the amount of effort that it takes to think critically. But we just can't avoid the brute fact that sometimes we don't have the wherewithal to make the effort required to be a critical thinker. Sometimes we're tired, sometimes we're distracted, sometimes we're angry, and there's always a host of implicit cognitive biases that are at work in our minds, kind of trying to drive our thought process in one particular direction and take our hands off the steering wheel of like what our own thoughts are going to be about. Effective critical thinking seeks to provide us with strategies for minimizing the effects of these stumbling blocks, even when we can't avoid them altogether. So I hope that this sounds like an interesting course. I hope that it sounds like a useful course. This course is useful as an introductory course to philosophy, mostly because it kind of goes through the philosopher's toolbox. It looks at like all of the methodological tools that philosophers use, the tools of rational argument, and explains how those work. So it's a great class to take before taking other philosophy courses. But I think this is a valuable class for anybody. I think this is the sort of class that anybody should take, if not through a philosophy department, then through some other sort of approach to critical thinking. What I hope that students of critical thinking get out of my class, and I would expect that they would get out of any critical thinking class, is that they become more civil, more productive, more discerning participants in public discourse. And that's something that I'll go ahead and go out on a limb and say that like we could use a whole lot more of. Our civil discourse these days is not particularly civil, it's not particularly productive, and it's typically not populated by participants who are particularly discerning. I hope that students get a better awareness of their own thought processes, their own psychological biases, and have some sort of sense about like how to strategize and counteract those psychological biases. I want students to be able to genuinely be thinking for themselves in the most exotic sort of sense, not just having opinions, but having opinions that they've kind of gone through the process of critical reflection about and kind of like seriously considered the possibility that just because something is believable to me doesn't mean that it's necessarily true, so I should kind of take a closer, more critical look at it. Maybe this gets to this idea of like having well-earned beliefs, that I would expect that students, when they get through a critical thinking course, not only are they going to be more skeptical of things that they're kind of initially inclined to think are true, but when they've gone through the process of effective critical thinking, they'll have even more confidence, and it'll be a well-earned confidence behind the beliefs that you come to through the right sorts of methods. I think that should do for kind of like general introduction to the course. If you have any questions or concerns or anything like that, please don't hesitate to reach out and contact me. Look forward to hearing from you.